All right, guys, so in this video, what we're going to talk about is over desire and the dopamine effect. So I think this is going to be really helpful because when we look at weight gain, if we go back to that weight gain or the inability to lose weight, it really comes down to two main things, right? From the physiological standpoint, we're experiencing over hunger, which is usually because the hormones are out of whack and we are desiring more food from a physiological standpoint than our body can actually use. But most of us recognize that a lot of the choices we're making in terms of food are not just driven from a physiological standpoint, right? There's something else going on. When we're eating the sweets or the cookies, the candies, things like that, we're often choosing them for different reasons, right? So that's what we're really going to talk about today, because I think the danger is that if you are someone that is experiencing this, and you feel like you can't stop, right? Like, okay, I'm going to stop eating the sweets, and then you feel like you can't. What most people are left with is a feeling that something is wrong with them. They have no willpower, they have no self-control, they have a food addiction, something like that. And that really makes us feel terrible and doesn't give us a lot of solutions or understanding to what's really going on. So I think this will be really helpful and help you really understand that really everything's working as it should be. You're actually perfectly normal. And it's just that we're living in a time when we are surrounded by things that are creating this drive with the brain and the brain chemicals. And so once we understand that, then we can come up with some strategies. So in this video, I'm just really going to talk with you and explain to you what's going on in the brain and really talk about that dopamine effect. So first of all, as far as desire and desire versus over desire. So desire is good. We're not talking about going through life and like not having any pleasure and everything being bland and blah, right? But over desire, the way I distinguish between the two is the desire can be satisfied, and over desire, it's almost like we get the thing and we just want more and more of the thing, right? Like, oh, I'm going to have a cookie. And it's like, oh, I need another. And then all of a sudden I've had 10 cookies, right? That's that over desire. Something else is going on there. We can also look at it in terms of true pleasure versus false pleasure. So false pleasure are things that feel really good in the moment, but there's often a net negative on the other side of that, right? So when I eat the 10 cookies, the net negative is weight gain or health issues or not feeling good, right? So we want to, move towards things obviously in our life that create more of that true pleasure, that we get them and then we feel satisfied. And that's not always foods, right? That can be, spending time with friends. That can be, being with our family. That can be working on a certain project. So as we start to shift and we are moving away from some of those false pleasures, we have that energy now to put into some of those true pleasures and true desires in our life, which is a really cool thing. So let's talk about dopamine. I'm sure you've heard of dopamine before. So dopamine is this brain chemical. Now, a lot of people think that dopamine is the thing that's giving us the pleasure, right? I eat the cookies and dopamine's released and that's what feels good. But really what dopamine is incredibly powerful. And it's the thing that's driving us towards the foods or other things that are going to then give us that hit of pleasure chemicals in the brain. So when we have something that releases those feel-good chemicals, dopamine is then what is released in the future that drives us back towards that thing. All right. So again, it's a very powerful. When we have something that releases these feel-good chemicals in our brain sees it as very, very important. I'm going to explain why here in just a minute. And so if you've ever felt like you have to have the thing, right? You have to have the cookies, you have to have the ice cream, you have to have the wine, whatever it is, that is that dopamine. And it really feels like on some level, like I'm going to die if I don't have it, right? It's like logically, that's crazy, but that feeling is there. And again, that's the dopamine. It's that drive that's pushing us back towards that thing and really doesn't like it when we say no. Okay. So the reason for this is like, if we, look back to like ancestors and times when, again, you couldn't just go and open up the refrigerator and get food. If you would come across something like some berries or some honey out in nature, you would eat that, and it's a very dense energy source in comparison to other things. And so we would get that hit of feel-good chemicals, and the dopamine would drive us back towards those things, which again is good in that time, right? It was part of survival. So dopamine is a good thing in and of itself, right? It's driving us towards these things that, not just help us survive, but make our life better, right? So food, of course, comfort, warmth, being with loved ones, connecting with other people, all those things had a survival element. But again, most of us would say also make our life better, right? So that's the good side of dopamine. It's not all bad. These are just some examples of those things that are good, right? And dopamine is driving us towards those things. But we live in a time where a lot of those things have been concentrated, right? So we take the sugar that we would normally get out of nature and it's amped up, 10 times, 100 times concentration. And so we get this very high release of brain chemicals and then a very high dopamine response. So the drive becomes very, very strong. And that's where, like, if you've experienced that, where you're like, oh, I'm not going to eat the sugar anymore, and you feel like you can't not do it, that is the dopamine response, right? Or if you've ever, been watching television, a commercial comes on, you find yourself almost like, a zombie going towards the pantry and getting something out and start eating it. That's the dopamine response. So if we're not aware of it, it's very, very, very powerful. And again, it's just trying to help us survive. So when we eat the ice cream and we get this high hit of these feel-good brain chemicals, the brain is interpreting that as, oh my goodness, this is so important for our survival. This is going to help us live longer. We're going to live forever. Like, we need more of this ice cream, right? But in reality, of course, we know that it's just because it's so concentrated. And so it's, again, just like with our hormones, like insulin, it's a response. It's kind of out of whack to what we would naturally experience. So, it's important to note here that the thing itself is not bad, right? We know foods are bad. We don't want to put those into categories, right? So we're not saying the ice cream or the cookies or the wine or anything is bad. But what becomes the issue is when we feel like we're acting against our own will. When we're like, I want to lose some weight. I want to cut back on these things, or I want to take them out of my life. And we feel like we can't do that. That's the issue. And that's where understanding what's happening in the brain and with the dopamine can become so helpful. So the ugly side to all of this is, of course, food manufacturers are aware of all of this. They know how the brain works. They know how that dopamine drive works. And so, of course, they're finding that perfect amount of sugar to put into foods that are going to drive us back and keep us addicted, and, of course, keep their wallets full, right? If you watch that film, That Sugar Film, it talks about this and how they work in the lab to find that perfect, I can't remember what they call it, but that perfect kind of sweet spot where it's just sweet enough that it releases all those brain chemicals and, of course, keeps us addicted and coming back for more. So that's probably not going to change, but once we understand what's going on, then we can start to take our power back and decide if we really want to fall victim to that system. So the culprits, like, what are the main things that are going to do this? And you probably figured this out already, right? Sugar, of course, and we're talking about processed sugar, the added sugars. Are one of the main things, because again, it's just so concentrated. We would never actually find that amount out in nature. So we're just getting this overabundance of those brain chemicals and that dopamine release. Flour, again, especially white flour, really any flours can do this. You want to be careful even with the quote unquote healthy flours, coconut flour or almond flour, because again, it's a concentration more than we would get if we were eating that food in its whole source. But especially if you're just getting started with this, it's that white flour. White flour has the exact same response in our body as sugar, pretty much, right? In terms of insulin response and in terms of that dopamine response. So those are the two main things I would focus on right off the bat, reducing or eliminating as much as possible. But just notice there's other things that do this as well. Of course, alcohol, I'm sure there's no surprise there. Social media is a good example of, we desire connection with other people. Social media is a concentrated force of that, which isn't to say that it's bad, but if you found yourself sort of mindlessly scrolling through it, again, that's that dopamine that's sort of driving, like, keep scrolling. Even drama, like, why are we all attracted to social, or not social media, but reality TV and things like that? Spending money, again, in and of itself, not bad, but when we're spending to try to get that feel good, that hit, and we're spending more than we want to, that's when it can become an issue. So dopamine is, really this powerful thing that's involved in a lot of our behaviors, more so than even just the food. So it's something that you can notice and be aware of. So what to do? I'm going to talk more about this in the next video, but just kind of off the bat, a couple of things. Just being aware of this. I mean, when I learned this, it was incredibly powerful because I was like, oh, now I understand what's happening. Before, it just felt like, you know, this force that was driving me towards these things that I didn't really understand what was going on. It's like, I have to have this, you know, I have to have the sugar. Why do I feel that way? So just understanding that was really, really helpful. We're going to talk more about noticing your thoughts, but your brain is going to really try to drive you towards those things. And so just notice what you're thinking about it. Create a little bit of space. Give yourself a little bit of time to just observe without judging what's going on and observing your brain. It can be really very interesting. And then we're going to talk about how to decondition the desire, right? So most of us have only ever known, okay, I'm not going to eat the cookies. I'm going to I'm going to be good. I'm going to willpower, white knuckle my way through it, which is kind of miserable. Or we feel like we're just giving in, or we're ping-ponging back and forth between those two things. So if you genuinely just didn't desire it that much, if it didn't have that much power over you, it would be way easier not to eat the stuff. So that's where we want to be. We want to be in a position where it's just not that interesting anymore. Like maybe I'll have a cookie, maybe I won't on a special occasion, but on my day-to-day life, I'm not needing those foods to, you know, keep me going. I don't feel like I'm eating against my own will. So that's what we're going to talk about in the next video. But hopefully you found this helpful and just kind of understanding what's happening in the brain. And again, that's really the first step, is just that understanding. So I'll see you in the next